Before I was a lecturer, I used to do stand-up comedy, and one of the interesting things about stand-up comedy is it raises this question: who is the person we see on stage? Well, we can answer that right now. It's me. But what does that mean? What does it actually mean to say that it's me? When I'm doing stand-up comedy, am I playing myself? Well, let's find out. Let's pretend this is a stand-up gig, right? What I'm going to do is, if this was stand-up, I wouldn't just be stood here like a lemon before starting. I'd be off stage preserving my mystique, and I'd go off. Well, I wouldn't go off. I'd be off there. I'd be back there, and then I'd be announced. I'd come on, and the audience would go crazy. The convention of the form is that you applaud when the act comes on, and it just creates a nice warm feeling. So, should we try that? I'm going to go off and come on, and you can pretend this is like an actual gig. Let's do it. Gulbenkian Theatre, please go mad to welcome on the stage your act for tonight, Oliver Double. Thank you. I hung back behind the curtain to milk it a bit. I don't know if you noticed that. Do you know what's really sad though is when you come on sometimes, because you have to fight your way through the audience, sometimes by the time you get on, the applause has stopped, it's run out. Oh, sad feeling. But am I playing myself? Well, this is an interesting view. This is a book that was written originally at the end of the 1980s about American television comedy. It starts with a really interesting in-depth analysis of American stand-up. And in that book, David Mark says, without the protection of the formal mask of a narrative drama, without a song, dance, or any other intermediary composition that creates distance between performer and performance, without even necessarily some remarkable physical trait or ability to gratuitously display, the stand-up comedian addresses an audience as a naked self, eschewing the luxury of a clear-cut distinction between art and life. That's quite a meaty quote there with a lot of interesting ideas. Talking about the idea that in this performance, it's nothing to do with songs or material, it's to do with the performer, him or herself. And what I love is this expression, addressing the audience as a naked self, because it's this image of self-revelation, of revealing my true self to you somehow when I'm performing. And I love this as well. It lacks a distinction, a clear-cut distinction between art and life. How do offstage and onstage relate to each other? How much is this an act? How much is this person just a person that we see on stage? Coming at the problem from a different angle, this is a book about acting. Now, clearly in acting it's different. In acting, the actor comes on and pretends to be a different person. So what John Harrop says here is that at the simplest level, the muscle man, the Miss Universe contestant and the stand-up comedian are projecting themselves. They may be making adaptations to the convention of the performance, but they are not playing a character. Only the actor is both present on stage and yet at the same time absent, replaced by the illusion he or she creates. So there are different views on this. Within acting, there are different ways of seeing this. Stanislavski and his inheritors argued that it's to do with identification with the character, that you should use your imagination to try and almost pretend to be that character, to feel the feelings they feel, and to almost convince yourself that you are that character, and by doing so, create empathy between your character and the audience. So you disappear behind the Macbeth or whoever it is you're playing. There are other views. David Mamet, the American playwright, says that the character is just an illusion created by the words he's written on the page, that the actor speaks clearly and the character only really exists in the minds of the audience, so there isn't that sort of psychological identification. And Brecht argued that somehow there should be both the actor and the character on the stage at the same time, so that you can sort of not only see the character, but you can also sort of see what the actor's view of that character is. But in any case, all of them are to do with playing a character that's not the person who's the actor, not the offstage, not the private person of the actor, but a character, a fictitious character. But on the other hand, muscle men, strong men, beauty contest people and stand-up comedians are projecting themselves. They might be making adaptations to the conventions. In other words, if you're a comedian, you might speak a bit more clearly. You might be a bit more flamboyant in the way that you use your hands and arms or whatever. And actually, crucially, you're going to be funny, because obviously nobody's funny all the time, but while you're being a comedian, you have to be funny. But apart from that, you're projecting yourself. But that's a really difficult idea to really get to grips with what that quite means. But it's an idea with a long history. personality in variety theatres was a key concept. Now, variety it grew out of the Victorian music hall. Victorian music hall was a kind of form where it started as informal singing in pubs and taverns, and it grew into a formal kind of entertainment in which professional singers did comic songs, mainly comic songs, in character for paying punters, and eventually the shape of the venues changed so that instead of looking like a pub, they looked like, say, the Hackney Empire, in other words, just like a theatre. And around the beginning of the 20th century, sort of between about 1900 and 1910, it started to change and mutate into what became known as variety theatre, which was a little bit different. The main difference was that instead of it just being about singers, there were different kinds of acts. There were performing animals and magicians and ventriloquists, singers, bands, comedians, and all kinds of speciality acts. And one of the key ideas in variety theatre was that personality was important. For example, the Stage newspaper, which is still published today, was a trade paper for entertainers, for performers and actors. And at this point, they used to publish an annual, which looked back at the year. And the variety correspondent of the Stage, in the Stage yearbook from 1953, says personality is still the first requisite when it comes to pleasing an audience. Personality is the main way that variety performers please an audience, that they make their act entertaining. But how can that be? Surely personality isn't enough, because personality, what does personality mean? I mean, if we had a conversation, when I wasn't lecturing, and we were talking about personality, if I said your personality, you'd assume I meant you, your psychological makeup, yourself, the combination of body and mind. That's what you'd think personality was. But surely it must mean something slightly more specialised than that in the context of show business. And clearly it did, because in 1938, the Variety Artistes Federation, which was the trade union for variety performers, a bit like Equity today for actors, it campaigned to try and bring personality into copyright law. So you could copyright your personality. And the reason they wanted to do this was because they wanted to prevent unauthorised reproduction of their personalities constituted as self-expression and mannerisms, which entertaining value of personality is the greatest asset an entertainer possesses and is the basis of the goodwill on which he earns his livelihood. Well, that's quite a statement, isn't it? I mean, the idea is that the personality is something you could copy and rip off, but it's also how you earn your money. It's how you make your living. It's how you put food on the table. And it's the thing that creates your market value, which makes you entertaining. So it must be more than just what we mean when we talk about personality casually. It must mean something more specialised, something to do with the way that you perform yourself. What is that? It's hard to say, but we can start to look at it. When we look at this guy, Teddy Brown. Teddy Brown was an American xylophonist who was born in 1900. He died in 1946. He was American Jewish, but he came to live in the UK, I think in his 20s, early in his career, and he built most of his career in the UK, and he played all sorts of different bands and things before he had his own band, and he was a big name in variety theatre, among other places. And there you see him playing his xylophone. And what's interesting about Teddy Brown is that in 1927, he was imprisoned for non-payment of income tax. But that's not the interesting bit. The interesting bit is at the time he was contracted to do a season at the Café Anglais. At the time, posh restaurants and hotels and cafes would employ acts, particularly bands and singers, to entertain their customers. And he was engaged at the Café Anglais, and when he got had up for tax evasion, the manager of the Café Anglais intervened on his behalf and made this public statement where he said, "I think there is a number of reasons why Mr. Brown should have special rebate. Owing to his immense size, he weighs 25 stones, his suits cost 3 times as much as those of an ordinary man. Then he has to consume big meals. To him, a £2 steak is only a d'oeuvre," meaning an hors d'oeuvre. And that's a bizarre statement, isn't it? Because what he's saying is that because he's an enormously fat man, he should have a tax rebate, that his food and his clothes that he fits in his enormous belly into should be tax deductible. Why? Well, the implication is clear. The implication is that somehow he makes his living partly by being fat, right? And that's a peculiar thing. That's the kind of thing you'd only normally get today on a documentary on Channel 5 or something. Why making a living by being large. That's a weird thing. But the point is, I suppose, that it comes back to this issue of personality. As soon as you say that somebody's personality is key to their act, then who they are, everything that makes them different from the next person becomes relevant. So their tone of voice, their choice of vocabulary, their accent, the pitch of their voice, their gestures, the way they stand, how they dress, and their size. Every aspect of their physicality is put under the microscope, as it were, and made more relevant. So Michael McIntyre, for example, he wobbles his head like this, doesn't he? His hair wobbles about. Now, that may have been an accident, maybe just an unaffected thing that he did off stage, but people latched onto that, and it's become part of his comic style. Then it becomes part of the product of Michael McIntyre. It becomes saleable. And if we look at Teddy Brown, he's playing the xylophone. And there's something that works in that idea, because there he is. He's actually, he's a very, very well-groomed, he's not a shabby guy, he's well-groomed. He's got his hair nicely slicked down. He's got an expensive white tuxedo on. He's got a carnation or something in his lapel. And he's playing the xylophone. But you could see how big he is. He's a really big guy. And the xylophone is a delicate instrument. It's got a little tinkling sound. And you make that sound with the mallets or hammers, making little tiny, delicate little movements on the keys. And so there's a contrast between who he is and what he does. And that contrast is effective. It's a novelty. It kind of works. I mean, actually, one of the things he would do is that he would start playing up here, and he would turn completely round, playing all the way, and then boom at the end, and people would applaud. Something very delicate about that. And my dad's father once saw Teddy Brown in the theatre, and he remembered him playing with very long sticks so that he could reach the instrument beyond his tummy. And in fact, if you go back and look at reviews of Teddy Brown, it talks about that. It talks about that contrast between his self, his size, and what he does, the playing of the instrument. And it talks about the mouse-like delicacy of the xylophone in contrast with how he looks, this mountainous appearance. The key then is the gap between art and life, between life and art, the line that separates the two. But where is that line? Is that line the front of this stage? Would I change if I leapt off like this? Am I now a different person? Probably not, but then you're still looking at me, so in a sense I'm still on stage. Do I change when I come back on stage? When I ran back on earlier, did I change? I don't know. I don't think I did. I'm not sure. But what we do know is that this kind of issue is one that comedians need to grapple with. For example, Stuart Lee used to do a routine about his ex-girlfriend's mother, where he was slagging off his ex-girlfriend's mother. And then, as he does, even now, this was an early routine, but it's typical of his style as it's developed over the years, he would then start critiquing what he was doing, and he would start criticising himself through the minds of the audience, projecting what he thought they might be thinking. And he'd say, you're probably saying to yourself, that's all very well, Stu, but you're making fun of your ex-girlfriend's mother, and in a way that's just like the old comedians with their sexist jokes about mothers-in-law, and in a way that's all you're doing. But that was different because they were talking about mothers-in-law. That was a comic archetype that was fictional and bore no relation to reality, whereas my ex-girlfriend's mother is a very real person. And then he would give her name and address out on the stage, which is quite a kind of breach of confidentiality. Now, when he first started doing it, he used her actual name and address, not a made-up one. It wasn't fictionalised. And then something went wrong, and this is what went wrong. This is what, as described in an interview. One night, I was in the backyard club that Lee Hurst used to run in Whitechapel, and I said the woman's name, and a girl in the audience shouted out, "What? Polly's mother?" Because she recognised, she knew Polly, his ex-girlfriend, so he was called on it, because suddenly it's like, "What? Polly's mother?" And life sort of intervened, and he said, and I thought, I can't do that ever again, and I had to say a different name. So then he changed the name and fictionalised it, and eventually went on to perform that routine on television. But what it shows is how if you start with the self as the starting point, if the act is built on the self, on the personality, what that means is that the line is permeable, that bits from your life can come from your life over that line onto the stage with you. And that creates certain ethical dilemmas, as in this case. But it can also work the other way around. So Jack Dee has built a career on being miserable and deadpan, and apparently he didn't always have that style. Apparently when he first started, he was quite jolly, and he wasn't that funny. And he decided he was going to give it up because he didn't think he was very good. But he decided to do all the gigs that he had lined up just to sort of, because he didn't want to let people down. But he came out on and did them with no effort, and that's where the deadpan style was born, because people reacted to it much better when he wasn't making an effort, when he was looking miserable and deadpan. And now people think he's like that all the time, but clearly nobody could be like that all the time. That's just a selected aspect of his personality that is edited and put under a microscope, as it were, by putting it on stage. But the problem is, most people only know Jack Dee from seeing him on television or on stage. So now they think he's like that the whole time. And what that means is when he interacts with people in the world, they sometimes get the wrong end of the stick. This is him talking about conversations he has with people in his everyday life. I unintentionally make them laugh because they think I'm being funny when I'm not. No one buys sincere from me. They always think I'm taking the piss. So he's just trying to have a conversation, but they think he's making fun of them because they see him through the prism of his stage persona. So in that case, what happens is, instead of life spilling over into the act, onto the stage, it's like the act spills off the stage into everyday life. But the point is this: we all have lots of different identities. So for example, you've probably got one of these. This is my Facebook. That's just a screen grab, but if we click on it, that's my actual Facebook. And I've got a message there. I'll check that in a bit. I posted just before I came on that I was doing a lecture on stage at the Gulbenkian. You can see that up there. That's actually what I'm doing right now. But that's not me, is it? That's a projection of me. That's a selection that I've made to present myself to the world. I've picked that picture of me on the cover photo. And so I've made a selection. I've chosen an aspect to amplify, as I would do in lots of other situations. Sorry, can we have the next, can you just minimise that? Brilliant, thank you. I have offstage and onstage selves. So that's me offstage and that's me onstage. They look very similar. I am the same person. But clearly, in the onstage one, I've adapted to the conventions of the form. I'm holding a microphone, I'm smiling. Maybe I wasn't feeling that cheerful. Maybe I was pretending to be jolly at that moment. But then again, the offstage photo, that was a photo taken me offstage. I mean, I knew that somebody was taking my photo. I was smiling. Was I performing? Was I myself? But we all have these multiple identities. When we have a phone voice to talk to somebody posh, if you're ringing the bank manager or something, you know, you put on a voice, and that is different from your everyday. Let's say you're in the middle of a party, a student party, and everybody's drinking around you, and then your gran phones. Suddenly you change from being party animal to, oh, hi, Gran. You're different. We all have different versions of ourselves. Maybe the onstage self is just a version of that. On the other hand, I've talked to comedians who say, no, that it's different. I change. I transform when I go on stage. Alexi Sale, for example, talks about his stage persona as him, not me, but him. He uses the third person to describe it. And he talks about when I get on stage, he takes over. It's a really interesting and slightly spooky idea. But I tell you what, I've been talking in public for about 30 years. Not this afternoon, 30 years ago I started doing bits of stand-up and that kind of thing. And either as a hobby or to make a living. I've done stand-up for a long time now. And I promise you, I've never been aware of having a stage persona that's distinct from me. I must change when I come on stage because there's the pressure and the nerves and things like that. But I'm not aware of doing things differently or saying things differently or my voice changing. So I'm not even aware of it myself. I don't know who I am on stage. I think I'm me. But it's a particularly edited version of me. So that's me. When you stop and think about that, it's quite interesting because it raises some interesting questions. When the actor comes on dressed as Hamlet, he's probably not wearing his own clothes, he's wearing a costume. But is this a costume? I'm on stage. Is this a costume? Is this me? Well, I'll tell you, I've been wearing it all day, and I'll probably take the jacket off when I go home and put on a pullover. That's what I normally do, because I like to get out of work mode. But that's a different kind of performing in a way. It's two different selves. It's work self and home self. So does this become a costume when I'm on stage? In the days of Variety, they would have special clothes. They wouldn't wear offstage clothes. Even if they looked like offstage clothes, they'd have special ones. And they used to have a thing, don't sit down in the props. The idea of that was if you sat down when you were wearing your suit backstage, you'd crease it and it wouldn't look so good under the lights. But most comedians just wear what they wear. On the other hand, some have special clothes to wear, but this is what I wear. Genuinely, I wear this. Also, my voice becomes part of the thing, my accent, my physicality. All of this becomes part of it because it's just me, but it's me under a spotlight, me under a microscope, me magnified somehow. Does that magnification come from me? I don't think so, personally. Does it come from the way you see me? Possibly. But ultimately, it's the unanswerable question. Who is that person we see on stage? Is it me?